In the weeks ahead, you will see these and other programs by various denominations. Welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue. The topic of today's program is the school health debate. Please join us.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion in life, produced by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, your host for today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And today we're going to have a look at what is one of the most heated of all controversies facing the people of Texas. And that's the issue of health education in our public schools. Many of our parents and professionals believe that our schools have a responsibility to tackle such issues as education concerning AIDS, sex education, but there are many others who believe that this should be a matter left to the home and the churches. Our guests today are two people who know that this will be an important issue for us to analyze together and to understand this health debate in the schools. Commissioner David Smith of the Texas Department of Health and Nancy McLaren of the Texas Association of Supervision and Curriculum Development. We're glad to have you folks with us today on what is very obviously a very hot topic. You read about in the papers, should the schools be teaching sex education, about AIDS? And I'd like to know, first of all, how you see the issue. In other words, let's start, Nancy, as an educator in the schools. Where are the points of contention?
Well, the points of contention are how much information schools should give students regarding issues related to human sexuality. Is there certain information that should be withheld? Should students be taught only one thing, and that's abstinence, and don't ask any other questions? Should they be taught methods of birth control? Is telling them methods of birth control and AIDS prevention, is that in fact encouraging promiscuity among students? Is it giving a hidden message that by giving them that information, adults think it's okay? All of those issues and others swirl around this debate, and the bottom line is there information that should be withheld from students in an effort to control their behavior?
Okay. And you see that one or another aspects of sex education very much is the nub of this controversy. You mentioned that first, and I think that's the public perception. Would you concur with that, David?
Yeah, I would, Richard. I think I would add that I think part of this debate is around honesty with kids. I mean, being a pediatrician, I think ultimately they do hear things. Do you want them to hear it correctly and be honest with them, or do you want them to basically say we don't discuss it, or we don't know anything about it, and leave them to their own devices to learn somewhere else? In the case of sex education, they will learn. There are other forms of media or other forms of information which are inappropriate, inaccurate, and can lead to high-risk behaviors. So do you leave them to those devices, or are you going to be honest with them and say, let's talk about it? In other words, and I guess the best analogy in the classroom, kid raises his hand, asks a question. Do you basically say, I'm sorry, it's off subject, we're not going to answer it? Would you do that in math, geography? In fact, they are asking. Data shows they'll ask, they want to know, and they sure know when adults lie to them and say they don't and they won't.
So it's a matter of where the information is coming from, or the misinformation.
He's exactly right. Several years ago, when I was assistant superintendent for instruction in Marshall, and we began to implement a human sexuality curriculum, we started talking with teachers. There are certain teachers in school that kids who are sexually active will seek out and confide in. And what we learned is that the ignorance among those students, even girls who were pregnant, couldn't explain how that happened. They knew what they had done, but they didn't know which thing of what they had done had led to the pregnancy. Now that seems astonishing to adults, but it was literally true.
Really operating in the dark.
Absolutely. And making decisions based upon either no information or, as David says, completely inaccurate information.
Actually, it's even, I totally agree with that. I mean, as both a pediatrician who's worked in those settings and as a parent, I've actually had teens come to me with HIV infected with the AIDS virus, or pregnant, or actually at the point of almost delivering, labor pains, belly cramps, not knowing what was going on. People say, oh, it couldn't possibly be. I will tell you, it's possible. It's not only possible, it's happened. Ignorance is something we need to fight here, and ignorance is hurting us. And this no longer is something where we can say, well, but the consequences aren't very serious. Wrong. The consequences here could be deadly, not to mention the trauma to that teen, which can disrupt their entire life.
Let me, just for a moment, have you share with the viewers, what is your experience where there are religious pressure groups saying, don't do it, or let somebody else do it? What's your experience, you know, at the school level or at the state level in terms of why are people, this seems so eminently reasonable to say, you know, this information is going to be communicated or not fallaciously communicated one way or the other. People are obviously in the dark about elementary kinds of things. What could be the objection to that kind of instruction?
What is the objection,
What is the objection?
of
Right.
religious pressure groups? They raise moral objection, that abstinence is the right decision for people who are not married. They believe that very strongly. I believe that. You know, most of the adults I know believe that. The fact of the matter, though, is that not all students make that decision. And the religious pressure groups that I'm familiar with approach the issue from a fear standpoint, that if we give students information, then that will encourage their decision not to be abstinent, and then they will be a party to that, what they consider to be a moral error.
Okay, so it's in a sense saying that the public school system would have a bias that is contrary to the convictions of perhaps a given religious group.
They basically don't trust the public schools to carry the message of human sexuality in a way that they think encourages healthy decisions.
All right. What's your experience along this line?
Well, similar, and it's ironic because what they would like to see happen, and let's use the word government, government being schools, government being health departments, come in and actually have no responsibility in this area, and that it be kept at home. In other words, the teaching, the discussions around sex, reproduction, condoms should occur at home because of these moral beliefs. It's interesting, and they want government out of that role, but they do want government in the role to say it cannot happen there either. They would like to see heavy government come in with regulations and prohibit it from occurring at all. It's fascinating. Actually, there's a dichotomy there. In one case, that government has a role. In one case, it does not. One thing we have to remember, there are no bad people in this. We want to quickly jump to a judgment and say, well, they're incorrect. They want to use stronger words. They're just stupid, ignorant. That's not correct here. People have their beliefs, they practice them, and they're trying to express themselves. The problem is they're trying to generalize when in fact the statistics show you're dealing with something that is very prevalent, sexual activity. 62 to 72% of our graduating seniors have more than one sexual partner. And you cannot generalize in this debate. It finally comes down to an individual that's either pregnant or infected with AIDS, so you can't generalize. You've got to be able to target and get a message out that's honest. The message here, though, is you've got to work with them. You've got to listen to them, and you have got to pull them in when you discuss what the community's needs are. If you don't, you'll polarize, and they'll probably defeat your efforts to do what's right, which is to, in fact, get this curriculum into schools and maybe go further and actually provide health care on the school campuses.
I think one of the issues, too, is we're in a pluralistic society. It's not just a Christian society, it's a society that's not just religious. You've got lots of folks who are in a secular mindset. So how do you come up with a policy which is meeting the greatest good for the greatest number and and recognizing the right of people who disagree with those policies to work for their change. I mean, run for school board or try to get the state legislature to change the laws. I mean, we recognize in a democracy that that is everybody's privilege and duty. But when you've got conflict that's just diametrically opposed, and you have to make the decision, it seems to me that's where, fortunately, we don't live in Iran with an Ayatollah Khomeini that just says this is going to be the rule for everyone. Mm-hmm. How do we, though, in a mixed pluralistic situation, be able to find that balance? And when it comes to AIDS, it reminds me about being a little bit pregnant, you know. I mean, there's no gradations when you come to some of those health threats. Mm-hmm. My guess is that as a health commissioner, you're seeing, from that perspective, that there maybe could be no compromise in certain ways in terms of getting certain information across. Is that your feeling?
Well, to be honest, in some areas I don't believe there is, but that, again, that's the end result. I realize I'm going to have to listen to debate and, in fact, pull groups in that may have different opinions than myself. That's the pluralistic society you talked about. But as a health commissioner, and actually as a former school board member, we actually need to make some tough decisions at some point because, in fact, there's tough things happening to kids. And at some point, you have to get on programs such as this and tell folks what are the facts. Mm-hmm. And they may not want to hear them, but we're dealing with something that's so serious, and I'm going to throw a new disease in, which is hepatitis B. Many may have read about Jim Neighbor's tragic situation where he now needs a liver transplant. You can catch that sexually. Through sexual intercourse, you can get hepatitis B, and it can wipe your liver out.
That's as devastating as AIDS, then? Or
yes, and actually the hepatitis virus is more infectious than the AIDS virus. But that aside, I've got to get the facts out. As a commissioner, I don't run a popularity contest. I can't. I run what I call a populist contest, which I have to look at the greater good and make sure you have the facts. I need to allow the community debate, but I'm going to create opportunities through education, and quite frankly, from what I'm willing to fund, like school-based clinics, to say you, community, can have this opportunity to get me in or our folks to talk about what's true, the fact there is this risk, and by the way, we'll have some resources available for you to hire a nurse practitioner or a health educator to get your campus started.
I'd like to come back to that health-based clinic because I understand you've got some of those in churches.
That's right.
And we'll pick up on that a little later, but I want to get Nancy's input at this point in terms of what Dave was saying in regard to the misconceptions. What are the facts? If my guess is that as a person working on the state level with curriculum, that you run across perceptions about what the schools are up to, which may not jibe with the facts. Is that correct?
Well, in some instances, that's correct. In other instances, there are genuine disagreements with regard to what we're about. Another aspect of this issue is that I don't know very many educators who seriously question the right of an individual parent to make a decision for the education of his or her child with regard to access to this kind of information. Mm-hmm. And in every situation I've ever heard of, if a parent has come forward and said, I don't want my son or daughter to be engaged in this kind of learning, that has been honored. That request has been honored.
And you know, one thing we have to honor is time. we're due to take a break right now in our show.
Okay.
Let's hold that and come back to it and have you folks come back and join us in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Serving Austin means serving you. Each day, Austin Metropolitan Ministries is Religion in Action, providing affordable housing, caring for the elderly, marching against hunger, and much more. AMM promotes understanding, cooperation, and social involvement. So when we ask for your help, we're really asking to help you, Austin. To find out how you can help Austin Metropolitan Ministries help Austin through its member organizations, just call 472-7627.
Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue. Our topic today is the health debate in the public schools, and our guests are Health Commissioner David Smith and Curriculum and Supervision Director Nancy McLaren. Nancy, just before the break, I was talking to you about what are the misperceptions about what actually are the policies of the state in terms of curriculum, teaching about these values, sexuality issues, and you were making some comment about that.
What I was saying was that when a parent makes a request that his or her child not be a part of that learning, that everyone I know honors that request. Now, in my own experience, in Marshall, which is in East Texas, where I was directly involved with such a program, in 3 years, we had only one parent request that a child not go through the particular lesson that we had planned for that grade level. So in actuality, the numbers who opt out are very, very small. Most people are open to that and think that there's a need for it. The issue is, does this small percentage of the population really have the right to determine for everyone what information will be withheld or given to students? And that, I think, is an ethical issue. Another thing I found in that experience in Marshall, again, is that when we mounted a lesson on AIDS or STDs, we did a lot with STDs because there was a tremendous amount of misinformation and lack of information about that. When we did those lessons, we manned a hotline in the case of our AIDS program, and in the case of STDs, we gave them the number of the local health department. And those telephone lines were flooded with calls from students who did not have information and knew that they needed it.
You're shaking your head there, David.
Well, the statewide hotlines, we always know when the campaigns are kicked off in the schools and the communities, the hotlines go crazy. And who's calling? It's the teens, and even younger, by the way. It's not even just teens. The preteens. We clearly get calls from 10, 11, 12-year-olds asking questions, and again, wanting an answer. They want honesty. Same experience both at a local level and a school board where I worked, as well as our experience at the state level. Very few parents ever really opt out. Again, the question, I think, that Nancy cited as a critical one, do we let a large, a clear minority dictate policy for a state, particularly when data, let's get away from emotion and data, where data shows we have a problem, and in fact we do know that information in the hands of folks, appropriate information and honesty, is the most effective tool we have in this battle.
Well, I think also one of the things that has occurred to me is I read about the controversy in Austin of sex education here, and Round Rock, comparable kinds of conflict. And just as a person from the outside looking at that, it seems to me that if the view prevailed that we didn't teach any of this kind of thing in the schools, then we become probably an inadvertent perpetuator of the AIDS epidemic.
That's right. That's correct.
In other words, to do nothing in that regard is really to do something. And in terms of people, if they don't know what the situation is and they get themselves infected and infect others, that we're contributing to that without an educational approach. And it seems to me that is an ethical issue in itself, whether a religious pressure group or some other type that's trying to say, just say no.
I think you're absolutely on target. I think that's clearly the case. I don't think folks want to realize that that inaction is, quite frankly, a way to lead children that could become pregnant or die from AIDS. That is clearly the case. And the problem in this debate is that there are really two barrels that you need to load full of ammunition. One is the message of delayed and appropriate sexual activity. Some use abstinence. I even worry about that word because to kids, teens, it scares them, and they really don't know it, and they know they're not going to be for the rest of their life. But you still get that delayed and appropriate sexual activity message out. It's a double-barreled shotgun. But when the data shows that 62 to 72% of these kids are sexually active with multiple partners by the time they graduate from all schools in Texas, not just areas like Austin or isolated pockets, you've got to have your other barrel loaded, and that's full of the appropriate information. Because again, as I will look anyone in the eye, you are not going to ever change the behavior of a dead person. It is that serious, and if you don't give them that information, one is they're going to get it somewhere else, like Beavis and Butthead. It's going to be bad information, could increase their risk activities, and you did indirectly lead to a problem with that child, that individual. And I'd ask the question, how many folks have sat across the table from a teen with HIV and listened to their story? Very few.
Let me give you a personal side to that, because I have. I had to look into the eyes of a former student who was a brilliant English student. He was a wonderful writer. He was a bright young man. He had a wonderful future. He came back to see me to tell me he had AIDS. And when I walked away from that very emotional meeting, the thought that came to my mind was, I taught him English, but he's not going to be able to use it, because he's not going to live very long, and he was dead within the year. And it's one of the most profound experiences of my life.
I see.
I was doing my job, but we didn't give him all of the information he needed.
But that brought it home to you.
Brought it home.
Let me ask you one other thing, Nancy. In the time that we have left, I think our perception is that the religious community, if it's saying anything in regard to this, tends to be just say no, be sort of negative in terms of its approach. What's the positive interface that could be had between folks of faith and those of you in the education field, the health field, in regard to these school health issues? How would you describe that?
Well, I've had experience in sitting down with a group like that, where we consciously selected for these decisions people who represented different parts of the community, including the religious community. And we included representatives from churches of all types. Now, it's tough work. We drafted policy and principles, and in fact actually scripted lessons, and included some very, very controversial issues. What I discovered in sitting down with a group like that is that regardless of disagreements, people who care about kids, who are intelligent people, who are willing to look at all of the information, can in fact come to agreement. Where we run into problems is when one small group that is not representative of the whole spectrum of the community begins to make decisions and implement policy, and people feel left out.
I've heard something recently talked about, oftentimes vocal control instead of local control prevails. David, before the show, you were telling me about church connections to health-based communities. Could you illustrate that for us?
Well, because of the fact that we've included the religious community in planning for school-based clinics, even some that give out condoms, we've also talked about better ways to get health care into the community where people live, rather than making them move and go somewhere else into a big medical center. We actually, in both the Valley, South Texas, and Dallas, and Houston, have started church-based clinics. We think school-based clinics make people nervous. Well, now we're talking about church-based clinics. It's amazing. The curriculum, quickly you will find, will pick up on these elements of sexual education, but it's much more. It's comprehensive. They'll also talk about diabetes and asthma and immunizations and anemia. So it's within a rubric that's much broader. It's called health, and indeed it's something you should know about to reduce your risk or just to be healthier.
Okay, well let's just pick up first on the school base. We kind of went over that too quickly. In other words, you have some schools that are the places that people, just students, receive. Maybe this is their primary way to get health services. Is that
often their only way? There are over 45 school-based health clinics in the state of Texas. One of the largest numbers in the country, one of the best kept secrets. The oldest ones are in Texas. They're in Dallas, West Dallas, 25 years old, and they're working quite well. They actually provide services not just for school-based kids, but also their younger siblings, kids that are preschool, because we know they're being neglected. Heavy dose of prevention, heavy dose of education. The school nurses are linked together with them because, as Nancy mentioned before the show, the school nurse is often the only health care they get. So let's make it more comprehensive. Let's have both a nurse, nurse practitioner, maybe a doc there and deal with it. We even deal with dental issues at many of these. But they're on site, they're convenient. In fact, 2 now are piloting to see the parents because we're finding that the parents are not receiving care either.
Oh, I see.
There the child is wheezing from asthma and the mom's holding them wheezing. Well, we can see the child and not the parent.
Right.
So we're expanding it as a more comprehensive model.
Do you have examples of that in the Austin or Central Texas area?
Yes, Zavala is one of the schools that we've opened up the Austin Independent School District to provide school-based health services. They're convenient, they make good sense, and just quickly I'll give the track record. They're very successful. Let me just hold the bottom line. They save money. People don't use the emergency room as much, the children, when they aren't admitted to the hospital as much. We also know their immunization levels are higher, and their level of anemia from iron deficiency, which, by the way, doesn't let you learn English as well as you should, is lower. So they make a difference. And they're very convenient, and we shouldn't make people go to the emergency room. The final thing I'd leave, we have a program on the street right now. We have $2 million that people can apply for across the state, including Austin. The audience should participate in that. Only 4 requirements. 1 is you see kids. 2 is you see preschool kids. This is the government talking to you. 3 is you need to take Medicaid, which is the way you pay for the poor kids. And 4 is please have after-hour evening services so they don't use the emergency room and set it up like a practice. That's what big government is telling you to do. There's nothing else. The rest is local control, and we want churches involved in the advisory boards.
Okay. Well, I think having churches involved in terms of being aware of this issue that's very close to home, as near as our local school, and yet in a sense it even raises the whole question of national health care and how we're going to approach this in a more global sense, which we don't have time for today, but I think just to note the context for that. The whole nation is thinking in health terms at this point. And the religious community, a final word, Nancy, in terms of, you said in curriculum development you have had experience with people coming together. And have you had the experience like with these community health-based ministries, services?
Good word.
Have you seen that in action from your standpoint?
I've seen that in action. And where there is a good advisory committee, it works. I think, bottom line, we have to say that these children belong to all of us. All of these children are all of our children.
Okay. Well, bottom line, that's as good a summary as I could think we could agree upon here today. And for you folks looking in, I hope that this discussion has helped stir up in your thoughts how we can work together to make a healthier, not just a state of Texas, but a state of mind and spirit. I'm Richard Thompson, on behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, thanking you for watching, inviting you to be with us again next week for our next edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Peace be with you.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.